Dr. Jack Matlock, former ambassador to the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia, serves as Troy University's ambassador in residence during the 2017-2018 academic year. During 35 years in the American Foreign Service, Matlock has served as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for European and Soviet Affairs on the National Security Council. He is the author of Superpower Illusions: How Myths and False Ideologies Led America Astray and How to Return to Reality, and Reagan and Gorbachev: How the Cold War Ended, among others. In this panel discussion in Troy TrojanVision studios, Ambassador Matlock talked about major events in his career, and indeed, events that have shaped and reshaped history since World War II. Joining the ambassador on the panel, Troy faculty members Dr. G. Doug Davis, who specializes in international relations, the Middle East, Europe, and contemporary philosophy. He is the author of numerous articles, reviews, and chapters. And Dr. Michael O. Slobodchikov, who specializes in relations between Russia and the former Soviet states, international conflict and peace, and comparative politics. He is the author of 2 books. Also on the panel is one of Troy's senior vice chancellors, Major General Walter D. Gavan, who is a decorated veteran of the United States Air Force, where he served as a command pilot, vice commander of Air University in Montgomery, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Gavan is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Davis begins the discussion with a question about Ambassador Matlock's earliest Foreign Service posting.
When you joined the diplomatic corps, you were sent to Africa.
Yes.
And in Africa, you were stationed both in Ghana and Tanzania.
Right.
What did that experience show you? What did you experience in Africa?
Well, there were several conclusions, of course. This was a time when there was a decolonization. These countries were becoming independent, in this case from the British Empire. And so that was one of the lessons, the way empires were breaking up. The other was I was sent there really to look at what the communists were doing, what the Soviet Union and China. And my conclusion from that was that the African exposure to communism was going to turn out to be an inoculation, not a source of infection. So, in a sense, what I saw in the decolonization was relevant later when the Soviet Union began to break up.
Excellent.
And also the idea that communism was not an inevitable thing in the future also turned out to be true.
Excellent, great. Now, you also had a unique experience working in Moscow during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
What was that like? What was the nature of your participation in that crisis?
Well, my job there included translating Khrushchev's messages to President Kennedy. We in our embassy were very calm because we knew that Khrushchev didn't want to go to war. We didn't understand, though, that the commanders, the Soviet commanders, both in their submarines and on their missiles, could actually have fired those missiles if they had come under attack. So, and you know, if that had happened, well, they could have taken out Miami, for example, and then what would we have done? So actually, it turned out that was a much more dangerous crisis than those of us at the American Embassy in Moscow understood at the time.
Yes, and I believe you mentioned that your time there, even the Soviet leadership in what would be their equivalent of the State Department was not aware of the missiles there.
Well, actually those of us certainly at my level, and I think it probably went up to the ambassador's level, did not know that part of the agreement was to take our missiles out of Turkey, because the agreement had been one that Kennedy had worked out actually through the KGB, that they would withdraw their missiles from Cuba sort of openly, and that we would withdraw the intermediate range missiles we had in Turkey. Then, since it was going to be known that we withdrew, they spread the story at least among the staff, that Kennedy had actually decided on that earlier, and it was just the bureaucracy was slow in carrying it out. Actually, it was the result of the agreement with Khrushchev. So in effect, we insisted on him taking sort of a public defeat, where actually it was a 50-50 exchange of things.
Excellent. And you played a critical role in the bringing about the end of the Cold War. Can you tell that story briefly, how the Cold War ended?
I think that, well, I was asked to advise the Reagan administration about how to negotiate with the Soviet Union. And though we had a group of consultations on Saturday morning with senior officials and Secretary of State Schultz. And we developed what was in effect an overall agenda, which not only involved things we were going to try to do, which was to get agreements to reduce particularly nuclear weapons, but weapons in general, but also some of the things we were not going to do. We were not going to try to change the Soviet regime, and we were not going to try to get military superiority. And Reagan approved all of these things, and we were able to then develop an agenda which actually fitted what a rational Soviet leader would want to do to reform the country. In other words, we tried to transform what had been very contentious issues into issues that both sides not only could live with, but would improve the situation.
So it was a win-win. And the conventional understanding of the Cold War is very different.
That's right. The fact is, we negotiated an end to the Cold War with terms just as advantageous to the Soviet Union as to us. So in that sense, if it was a victory that both sides won. Now, the reason I think many people say that we won the Cold War and they were defeated was that subsequently the Soviet Union broke up. What they're doing, they're conflating several things that happened in succession very quickly. One thing was the breakup, was the end of the Cold War. I think that ended ideologically by the end of 1988, for example. Certainly by the time the Berlin Wall came down and the communist regimes fell in Eastern Europe, that confirmed that it was over. Then the Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union, but not because of the Cold War, but because Gorbachev was trying to reform the Soviet Union. And when parts of the Communist Party resisted this, he actually took the party out of control. So the second thing that happened was the Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union, which could not have happened if the arms race and the Cold War hadn't ended. Then the Soviet Union broke up, but not because of external pressure, but because of internal pressures within the Soviet Union that pushed it apart. Now, this was something that was not an aim of the United States. In fact, we tried, the first President Bush tried to help Gorbachev keep most of the country together in a voluntary federation. So the idea that the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that that was a defeat or a quasi-military victory by the United States gets everything almost backwards.
That's correct. General Gavin, you yourself were in the military at this time, and you were very active. You were in Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. What would be the military's perspective of the end of the Cold War?
Yeah, it was interesting because I had previously been stationed from '86 to '89 in Bitburg, Germany. And I was flying F-15 Eagles. And one of our missions there, we had what we call Zulu Alert. So literally 4 pilots with 4 fully armed jets would be on alert, and we do it 24-hour periods. And if an East German aircraft or anybody straight over a Warsaw Pact aircraft straight across the border well, literally the klaxon would go off. We would go down the fire pole, run to our jets. We had to be airborne within 5 minutes with live weapons. And we raced towards the border. So, you can imagine, and I did several of these scrambles, many during the course of that, and, studying the Soviet threat, doing recognition, what is this helicopter going to look like, this fighter that we would have to intercept. So it was really fascinating to go from this concentrated Cold War state of readiness exercises, actual scrambles, and then I'm actually serving as a liaison officer to an Army unit that had a border mission, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, and within a month after I show up, the wall falls in November of 1989, and I'm shoulder to shoulder in the Marktplatz in Nuremberg, Germany, with East Germans pouring across, and the world is changing. And so then obviously we're having to your son, I remember wondering, okay, well, this is going to change everything for us. And so seeing the military and how we began to change and we began to adjust to this, but slowly. So I had some concern there, because what is it? It's inertia. You keep doing what you've been trained to do, and so you worry maybe actually in this time where everything is changing that something might happen. And so I was very happy that we were all cautious and actually nothing did happen.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And Ambassador Matlock, after the end of the Cold War, we seem to learn lessons, but they may have been the wrong lessons. What lessons should we have learned from this event in history?
I think one of the lessons should have been that we in this nuclear age, when war would be catastrophic, we need to use diplomacy, and that it's important to obviously to keep your military strength. It's important to keep your economic strength, but you're much better off finding diplomatic solutions, win-win solutions to confrontations, than to trying to push the other side or force the other side to do something. And that one thing. But the second thing was that I think we misinterpreted that the end of the Cold War as a U.S. victory, which in effect was, as Francis Fukuyama said in a famous article, the end of history. We had proved that our system of government was the future and was the best for all of mankind. Well, it didn't prove that at all. I mean, it certainly proved that we had a healthier economy and a healthier society than the Soviet Union did. But it didn't mean, number one, it didn't mean that we had the power to change other governments. Remember, one of the reasons we were able to end the Cold War, we resolved not to try to change the Soviet government. Our view, it's certainly President Reagan's view, was this is a lousy system, but if that's what they want, that's their business. What we object to is them trying to force it on other people. When they stop doing that, that's the thing. So that's why it's stressed that the system brought itself down when there was peace. And actually, trying yourself to bring pressure to bear on them tends to preserve that system. Because if we had tried first to, you might say, bring about regime change, bring about, say, the communist system had to change before we could deal with them, and that we could make it change by pressure, we would probably still have the Soviet Union, and we'd probably still have some sort of arms race.
That's true. That's true. Dr. Sabachnikov, how do you think that changed international relations, the end of the Soviet Union? How did that change the world in which we live?
Well, I think from one perspective, the United States saw itself as the most powerful country in the world, and acted like it a lot, and forgot some of the lessons from, as Ambassador Matlock was talking about cooperating and creating win-win situations. And so I think part of American diplomacy became, we'll tell others how they need to act and how to live. And so that came with being the world's first and foremost superpower. And so it really changed the whole system of international relations from that point on.
Ambassador Matlock and Dr. Matlock. My next follow-up question for you would be, what is your impression of the expansion of NATO as NATO has moved into the countries that actually border Russia and into encompassing former Soviet territories?
I think that was a big mistake. I think that actually we should have greeted the end of the Cold War and the fact that Europe became peaceful and free, and we should have tried to perpetuate that by including Russia in the European security system. And that would have meant several things. One thing, develop a system that included Russia, keeping NATO as it was to keep our own presence, but at the same time scale back so you don't have an American commander. After all, why shouldn't we have a European commander? American participation, yes. We keep NATO, among other things, to keep Germany under control. You know, the original goal of NATO, as the first Secretary General said, was to keep the Russians out, keep the Germans down, to keep the Americans in. Well, frankly, we still needed to make sure Germany doesn't break out and, you know, threaten the others. So I think we had the opportunity to keep NATO, to step back a bit, to encourage the Europeans to also have an independent security possibility, so that, and there were attempts at that, so that the U.S. wouldn't be sort of in the lead there, but you would have a European lead. And of course, that would give us also the opportunity to do the same sort of arrangements elsewhere in the world, that we don't try to be the world's hegemon, but we try to cooperate with others. And if they're going to have local fights, let's try to calm it, but we don't try to take sides. That would have been my preference.
Okay, so so you were in fact a critic then of the Clinton administration and its policy at that time, as you were, I believe, a critic of the George W. Bush administration.
Yes. Well, I think first of all, I think they were asleep at the switch on 9/11. That could have been prevented. And it could have been prevented fairly easily if they had paid attention, because our pilots, our commercial pilots, were instructed if there was a hijacking to do what the hijacker said. The idea being they only want you to take them somewhere, you save everybody. Well, there had been at least 2 attempts to hijack planes in order to fly them into buildings. And that had been the thing. Now, so the first thing they should have done was to have a meeting of senior people and saying, we've got this report now, you know, FBI, CIA, check your records and make darn sure you know where anybody connected with Al-Qaeda is. And then FAA, you know, what are instructions to pilots? Well, you know, you better tell them, lock that cockpit and under no circumstances turn over the plane to anybody else. Now, you know, something like that would have leaked, of course, even if, and they would have had to call off the operation. But even if they didn't, if that cockpit was leaked, even if they, you know, attacked a member of the crew or cut her wrist or something, they couldn't take over the plane. So, you know, when you think about it. Now, the thing is, the president ignored it, and he had 3 warnings about Al-Qaeda, and they just sort of put off doing anything, and didn't notify anybody else in the government. But having done that, then I think the next bad decision was the one to invade Iraq, because Iraq had not attacked us. We didn't have permission in the UN. And of course, this was going on when we also continued to expand NATO. We walked out of the ABM treaty with Russia, which had been the basis of arms control, and we began to act more and more and more as if Russia was a potential problem. It really wasn't then, and their interpretation of all of this is that we were building up an attempt simply to control them and turn them into a virtual colony. Now, a lot of that was misinterpretation, but the fact was, as I've said, we did a number of things that without really considering how Russia might react, and they overreacted, and this has brought on, led to the current estrangement that we have.
Yeah, picking up on the current estrangement, what is your evaluation of the Putin leadership of Russia?
The Putin issue,
Yes.
as far as our elections, or you mean, or in general?
But also as far as just his
you know, I
orientation.
think one thing, there are several things one can say about Putin. First of all, he took a country that was virtually in chaos, and he put a certain order back in. They were bankrupt when he became president. They had paid off all of their debts by about 2005, 2006, and built up, actually a surplus to the point that when we went through the world recession around 2008, 2009, Russia was able to weather it. I mean, it cost us all quite a bit economically, but they were able to weather it. So for most Russians, he restored a certain amount of order and also a degree of prosperity, at least for an important minority, to Russia, which they didn't have before. Now, he has become increasingly authoritarian and cutting back on a number of liberties, but not all. Russians still can travel freely, which was not true in the Soviet Union. They still have a pretty reasonable freedom of speech. Yes, Putin controls most of the media, particularly television. But on the other hand, this is nothing like the sort of controls that the Soviet Union did. Of course, we have particular problems with what happened in regard to Ukraine, and their taking of Crimea was illegal, and it's something we should not recognize. On the other hand, we set precedents for many of the things that he has done in our activities, such as the way we dealt with Kosovo, for example, and in attacking Serbia without UN approval. So it's, in some cases, our accusations are a matter of, the pot calling the kettle black. And now we accuse the Russians of interfering in our elections, when, quite frankly, we've been interfering in theirs for years, every time since 1996. So I'm not saying that turnabout is fair play. I am saying that right now some of this hysteria about Russian interference, I think, is out of place, and it distracts us from what the real problems are.
Yes, I agree. General Gavon, you actually participated in some kind of exchange with the Dartmouth group, and what is your assessment of our relationships with Russia based on your experience with this group?
Yeah, just to remind everybody, the Dartmouth Conference was something that originated during the Cold War, and it was about an unofficial delegation of Americans meeting with an unofficial delegation of Russians, just to keep in that case, Soviets, to keep the conversation going even when times were very frosty, relations were very frosty between the countries. Well, this was resumed just about 3 years ago as relations began to deteriorate somewhat. And I think a very worthwhile sort of back channel to have in the conversation. My only frustration as I've participated, and I've really enjoyed getting to know my Russian counterparts and talking, is that as one who had some opportunities to negotiate in an official capacity with Russians, that my unofficial Russian counterparts seem to behave more like they're in an official delegation. It was very, very difficult sometimes to get those frank exchanges that you were hoping to have, and to be creative about, hey, well, can't we work on this, a medical issue, or can't we work, what about this, to propose something sort of out of the ordinary. And we didn't make a lot of progress sometimes on that, but sometimes the progress is not so much the point as to continue the conversation. And so I think all of these sort of exchanges are very worthwhile, and we need to take every opportunity we can to try to understand each other better.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you. Dr. Samachkov, briefly, I would like you to talk about your participation on the BBC, in which you were asked at one point to explain Russia's version of its own Monroe Doctrine. that Russia has regional interests that are specific to its, I mean, it's regional, its geography?
Well, I think building off of what Ambassador Matlock talked about with the expansion of NATO to Russia's very borders, Russia created its own Monroe Doctrine where it was not willing to allow NATO to expand into the former Soviet republics beyond the 3 Baltic states. The 3 Baltic states, Russia had been willing to allow into NATO, but the rest of the former Soviet republics, Russia was not willing to allow to join NATO, and had very serious concerns about NATO even being an option for them, and this played out in the Ukrainian situation, where protests broke out, and the U.S. did urge protests against the Ukrainian president, and Russia saw this as further evidence of the U.S. trying to take away its former republics and gain influence directly on its borders. And so it reacted very strongly against that, especially in first Crimea, and then followed by in southeastern Ukraine and Donetsk. And
Excellent. Ambassador Matlock, returning to, how do you see the events in Ukraine? Ukraine is a very fractured country with a political leanings on half the country that favors the West and the other half of the country favoring Moscow. What long-term solutions do you see as viable for Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine is a very divided country. And, you know, it had has still a constitution which, in effect, gives the person who wins the presidency almost complete control. For example, the president can appoint all the governors. So they don't really have a federal system to handle this difference. Whereas in the West, you get very strong Ukrainian nationalists that will vote 85 to 90% in favor of, you might say, a nationalist candidate. And whereas in the East and South, you have a much more Russian-speaking, comfortable with Russia population, which will vote 85 to 90% in favor of, you might say, a pro-Russian candidate. That's not the only issue, but that's a simple way to put it. Now, I would say their basic problem is when they got their independence, they did not have a Nelson Mandela. They did not have a political leader capable of bringing the country together. And instead, they had these back and forth elections. One president would win by a little over 50%, appoint all the governors. Then the other might win, and actually both sides, one was as corrupt as the other. It was just different people were getting the results of the corruption. So that, you know, Ukraine was struggling just as was Russia to throw off that Soviet heritage. After all, the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian security service, everything was former Soviet. And in fact, it had been the same as Russia's. So and then to complicate the whole thing was one of Russia's most important naval bases at Sevastopol was located in the Crimea, which had been administratively transferred to Ukraine by Khrushchev. Historically, it had not been part of Ukraine, though at that time he didn't transfer Sevastopol. Sevastopol remained directly under Moscow's control. So it's a complicated issue, but in general, it made it very sensitive when Ukraine suddenly had this actual revolution in 2014, and the thought was that if Ukraine joined NATO, that they would lose that naval base, which is one of Russia's most important ones. And I think that was one of the big issues that brought Putin to sponsor a referendum and a vote on the end of people in Crimea to join Russia. Actually, I think there's little doubt that the majority of people in Crimea preferred to be in Russia, not the 90-odd% in that referendum, but probably a nice solid majority. So, you know, these things get very complicated. Of course, one can say it was illegal for him to take it. On the other hand, another principle we have often said is there should be national self-determination. We also usually advise countries, if they have different populations, why don't you have a federation the way we do, with a maximum local control? So, you know, in all of these various issues, I would say yes, many of the things Russia did was illegal. But on the other hand, many of them, if you look at, you know, you could have to qualify with a lot of but, this and that. But I think for President Putin, the biggest issue was that of Sevastopol. And if there had never been a question of Ukraine entering NATO, I don't think he would have taken Crimea.
Approximately 3 years ago, you were invited to Russia to talk about democracy, and I believe you participated in a conference with President Putin. Well, can you describe the interaction with Putin at that time?
Actually, when I came to give some lectures on civil society, that was I was actually invited by people who were close to President Medvedev.
Okay.
Later, I was invited to the Valdai Forum, which was held at Sochi, and they asked me to be on the same platform with President Putin. And I used, actually, they said I could talk for 7 minutes. I think I may have talked for 15. But what I wanted to do was explain to the Russians that it was not we who brought down the Soviet Union, but Boris Yeltsin, their elected leader. You know, don't blame us if you don't like the fact the Soviet Union collapsed. Your people did it. And actually, of course, Yeltsin was the person who had actually named Putin as his successor. So that was the main point I was trying to get across, that, you know, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was not the result of the Cold War, and it was not because American presidents tricked Gorbachev and so on. But when I finished, Putin asked me directly, what do you think about your American missile defenses in Eastern Europe? And I said I was opposed to them, but because I don't think they're necessary, but I don't think they affect your security. I don't think they, you know, affect your ability to retaliate, you know, on a potential strike. And then he said, well, why did you deploy them? And I said, I think it's basically because our military-industrial complex. There are a lot of jobs there, and this, you know, politically, there was a lot going on. And then he said, well, wouldn't it have been better to use it on your infrastructure? And I said, well, that would be my preference, but politically, in the United States, the deployments were there. The point being, I kept saying, they're not directed at you. And you know, I agree that they're not necessary. So we had that direct exchange on television, which was televised at the time. But and he explained, actually, when we talked about the breakup of the Soviet Union, I had referred to his statement that the breakup of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest geopolitical tragedies of the 20th century. And I had said, I'm not sure I would call it the greatest. Actually, the word he used in Russian can be translated either the greatest or one of the greatest. It's not an absolute superlative. It's usually quoted as an absolute superlative. But he said, the reason I said it was a great geopolitical catastrophe is it left so many Russians outside their own country. So he sort of explained it that way. So we had that exchange the one time that I was on the platform with him.
Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm. Hey, my next question, excuse me, is If we look at the accusations of Russia meddling in the election, what is your impression of that?
I think that they're largely misplaced. I think that what we had was at least some Russians, and it may or may not have included President Putin, did some very silly things like hiring trolls on the internet or buying some ads on Facebook. Frankly, I don't think any of this had an effect. As far as the hacking is concerned, I think it's very probable the Russians did the hacking of DNC. I'm not at all sure it was the Russians that gave them to WikiLeaks. There are at least retired intelligence officers who have examined it and say, you know, that was an inside job at the Democratic National Committee because the downloading was too fast for the internet. It had to be on a thumb drive. But you know, so the idea that that they were trying to affect our election, even assuming they did it, is a little hard to understand. I think if the Russians did it, and I'm willing to accept that's entirely possible, they weren't trying to elect Trump, although it's no question, inasmuch as candidate Trump had said it's better to cooperate with Russia than to be enemies, in effect. They obviously liked that. None of them thought he was going to win. But I think that if they did that, it was a signal to Secretary Clinton, take us seriously. You know, you guys have been putting us down. President Obama had been saying, oh, they're only a regional power, et cetera. And he also said publicly at one point, they don't make anything anybody wants, or they're only a regional power. Well, they have the only lift capacity to take people to the International Space Station, and I think they want to say, don't forget, we may have some cyber capabilities, you fellows. And also, don't forget, they've got Snowden. And I suspect they know that most likely, I don't know this for a fact, most likely we have penetrated almost all of their comparable things. Now, and I won't go on. There are some examples I could give that they're probably blaming on us, particularly these Panama Papers. I think they would believe that that was an NSA operation, particularly since there's not a single American involved in the thing. I don't know whether it was or not, but you know, I think there are many ways to explain this, but also I would say, as our intelligence agencies said, one thing, there was no forgery. What they revealed was the truth in terms of these. And second, the intelligence agency says there's no evidence they attacked any of the vote counting machines. In other words, they didn't meddle with the results. And so, you know, and before that, in the introduction to that intelligence report, one of the sentences is, we're making no assessment of the impact in the United States. Now, when you say meddling or when you say interference, you're assuming there's an impact. And this is something the intelligence agency specifically said they were not doing. So I think this whole business has been most misguided for a number of points of view. One thing, it distracts us from the fact that, well, President Trump did win that election. He won it in the Electoral College, which obviously the Russians didn't set up. That's our Constitution. And the fact is that if people who don't like that election, well, they should be looking at why he was elected and not, you know, looking for scapegoats. The second thing, which I think is very bad, is I think it is very much in our national interest to get back into a more normal relation with Russia and stop considering them as if they were major enemies. I don't think there's any necessity for them to be. And therefore, particularly the nuclear issues, I think that it's imperative that we cooperate with them more. And yet this whole political, and I will use the same word President Trump has used, it has taken on sort of the aspects of a witch hunt. I think that's distracted us from doing what we really need to do in our national interest.
Excellent. I would like, General Gavin, what is your assessment of the future of U.S.-Russian relations?
Well, I've been very disappointed to see them deteriorate to this point. What I'm hopeful, because I am an optimist, and we've got good people like Ambassador Matlock still very much engaged who have the background and all, is that we can come to this awareness that it really matters between us with the capability that we've got, that we have to find a way to work together. And then I'm hoping that especially this, what has focused us before is that awareness of that nuclear capability and the implications of that for both societies. I think we can find a way to improve relations. I think I'm very much a realpolitik sort of guy on this. I know that there are limits. It's not Pollyanna sunshine that I see in that, but good, hard people working together. I think we can start to make some steps.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Samachkov, what is your assessment of the future of American-Russian relations?
I think I'm a little bit more pessimistic than you are, General Gavin, although I will say this. I will say that we need more Ambassador Matlocks. We need more people to say there are avenues of cooperation where both sides can win. And when you start to put together cooperation where both sides can win and you bring people together to talk and cooperate, it does take off. So things like the Dartmouth Conference, more exchanges among young people, more person-to-person exchanges, cooperating on things like terrorism and issues that would benefit both sides will start to improve relations. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we can start to do that, providing we can get past some of the larger issues.
It's hard work, though. I mean, let's be clear. This is hard work, and it's going to take a lot of people involved to make it happen.
I too am an optimist. And when I went to work for President Reagan, I don't think anybody would have predicted that we would essentially end the Cold War during his presidency. In fact, it was thought that he was making things even more dangerous. Unexpected things can happen, and I'm with you in being an optimist. We'll find a way.
What specifically can they tell us about current relations? In other words, we looked at the basic lessons of the Cold War, but what we didn't do is apply them back to the present. What do you think, and how relevant are those lessons for us moving forward?
I think the lessons we should have learned are extremely relevant. First of all, the first agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev made, a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and therefore there can be no war between us. That sounds like, well, okay, doesn't everybody know that? And yet, when you think about it, then okay, why do both sides keep, deploying weapons? Why are we, why are there fighter planes, buzzing our ships? Why are we necessarily, always patrolling borders as if there's a possibility of conflict? So, I think if we go back to that understanding, first of all, and then remember that in the long run, keeping the peace between us is much more important than precisely where each border is. And what happens in Ukraine is infinitely more important to them than it is to us. We have lived most of our natural history with Ukraine being an integral part of Russia. Now, all right, we don't have to approve what they've done. In fact, I think we shouldn't recognize it. But on the other hand, to try to punish them when, that really makes them be even more firm in not backing down, as we would be if somebody, remember, millions for defense but not 1 cent for tribute, going back to our own revolution. So I think we have to understand that when it is an important issue for them, and particularly when it's a rule that one can argue we have broken also, that we got to give them a little bit of elbow room, and step back. And in fact, it would be much easier, I think, for Ukraine and Russia to work out their things if outsiders weren't involved. It's essentially a family fight, and like most family fights, others who intervene tend to make it worse.
That's true. Great. Thank you, Ambassador Matlock, again for your time, and we have greatly enjoyed this. Thank you, Dr. Smochkov. Thank you, General Gavin.